Dr. Jon Karl Helgason is, as you know, a professor in the Department of Icelandic and Comparative Cultural Studies at the University of Iceland. He's particularly interested in the post-medieval reception of Icelandic sagas and 20th century Icelandic cultural history. So one of the books that's of considerable interest to us is one called The Rewriting of Njál Saga, Translation, Politics, and the Icelandic Saga. So it's about how Njál Saga was read later, recently indeed. His latest book, a biography of the Icelandic cultural patron Ragnar Jónsson, who lived from 1904 to 1984, was nominated for the Icelandic Literary Prize last year. So he is a man of many parts, and we're delighted to have him here.
Well, it's nice to be here. Thank you for having me. I've had a very, very nice day. I spent it bicycling out in the woods with Chris's husband, and it just made my trip perfect, I think. But when I came back, I hadn't eaten any lunch, so I went to the hotel restaurant and I had soup and beer, Corona, Mexican beer, and it tasted very good. But I've often thought about the meat of poetry, which is a part of Icelandic the Icelandic mythical world. I've often thought about how does that taste, because it's brewed in a very unusual way. According to Snorri Sturluson, it was initially a mixture of spittle of the gods and the Vanir generation. A man who was called Kvasir was made from this liquid, from the spittle, and then he was killed, and a meat was brewed from his blood and honey. And Odin, he later drank the meat, and he spewed it out again. And he also actually sent some of the meat backwards, what they called the Rhymester's shear. But the better part of it has still been through the stages of spittle, blood, and vomit before skilled poets are able to finish the brewing by delivering their wonderful poems. It has been conventionally argued that Snorri shaped the narrative. You see? Yeah, this is the recipe, if anybody is interested. That Snorri shaped this narrative, which is a part of the Prose Edda, in accordance with his own taste and purposes. Nevertheless, his account is an interesting description of the nature of poetic language, I think, crossing the borders between what is pure and impure, creative and destructive. From that perspective, the tale of the poetic meat may have inspired another Icelandic medieval text, that of Egil Saga, which is not only loaded with graphic descriptions of brutal killings, but contains repeated images of blood, meat, and vomit. I'm not going to talk about the relationship between Snorri's Edda and Egil Saga. Many people think Snorri actually wrote Egil Saga. But I want to contemplate upon the impact that Egil Saga may have on its audience, both medieval audience, but also just us, if we are interested in reading it. So what I'm going to give you tonight is what you might call an hypothetical reception study, borrowing ideas from the field of psychoanalysis and cultural history. But the topic suggested itself to me when I was teaching at the junior college in Iceland. And most Icelanders, they have to read maybe one or two, sometimes 3 Icelandic sagas before they reach the age of 20. And all of them read Njál Saga, many of them read the Egil Saga. And I was teaching one winter in a college like this, and I heard about a young woman who felt sick and had to be excused from class after having heard the teacher read a chapter from the saga. And I had not had the same experience, and neither in my college years when I had read the saga, as a part of my curriculum, but neither later in life when I choose to include Egil Saga in my university studies. On the contrary, I felt Egil Saga was both an intriguing and masterfully constructed narrative. And these different responses, they puzzled me for some time. How could the same literary text be a source of pleasure for one person and completely repulsive for another? So I'm going to try to answer that question tonight, and I'm going to be influenced by 3 20th century writers, Sigmund Freud, Julia Kristeva, and George Bataille. And I think all of them would agree that scenes from Egil Saga are designed to make strong and sometimes conflicting impact on the minds, the emotions, and even the bodies of its readers. So we'll start with Freud. But you should also have Snorri in mind. In an article he wrote in 1919, Freud defines the uncanny as that domain of the horrific which can be traced to the past, toward childhood or more primitive ways of life. We find those things uncanny that were once familiar to us, but have ceased to be so, the things that used to be of importance to our minds and emotions, but have been suppressed in our consciousness. Freud opens his article by discussing the paradoxical sense of the German word das Heimliche, which refers at the same time to what is familiar and foreign, mysterious and horrific, even something that has been revealed but should have been hidden. And he refers to some examples from the world of fiction to illustrate his point, but he makes a note of the fact that various things that we might find uncanny in reality will have little or no effect when we read about them in literature. But on the other hand, he adds, there are more ways to create uncanny effects in literature than in real life. Through their unusual access to our minds as readers, writers are capable of manipulating our emotions with various descriptions of the uncanny. The examples he discusses are of different nature, but quite a few of them are relevant to Egil Saga. Descriptions of blinded eyes, amputation, and decapitations are all likely to trigger uncanny emotions, Freud tells us. In particular, if a hand is cut close to the wrist, or when amputated limbs show signs of life. If we look at Egil Saga from this perspective, we are told that Egil gouts out with his finger one eye of Ármóður beard, leaving it hanging on its cheek. And it's a scene that very much refers to Odin, the one-eyed Odin, of course. Egil also chopped off the leg of Ljótur the Pale and another leg of one of his adversaries at the island of Sauðey. He almost decapitated Bergönundur, and in one of his many skaldic verses he boasted, "We made bloody bodies slump dead by city gates." Last but not least, the dispersal of the human body is celebrated in a skaldic verse by Skallagrímur, Egil's father, a verse he speaks after he and his father, Kveldúlfur, have killed Hallvarður Travelhard and 50 of his crew members. I think, well, this is the next example, but Skallagrímur says, Hallvarður's corpse flew in pieces into the sea. So there are a lot of examples of this kind in Egil Saga. Another uncanny element that can be applied to Egil Saga is the idea of double reality. In this context, Freud discusses the literary tradition of the doppelganger, but also the effect that repetitions of the same circumstances, characteristics, or even the same names in one generation after another can have on us as readers. And in Egil's saga we come across characterizations of Þórólfur, who is the son of Kveldúlfur on the one hand, and then Þórólfur, who is the son of Skallagrímur on the other hand. Maybe I should make this. So we have Kveldúlfur, who is the grandfather of Egill, and his son is Þórólfur, and the other one is Skallagrímur, and he has two sons too. One of them is called Þórólfur, and the other one is Egill. And what you have there is how these two Þórólfurs are described. I'm not going to read these quotes. I hope you can see them clearly, but it's almost the same characterization being repeated first in the beginning of Egil's saga, and then when you're maybe 1/3 into the saga. But we may also think about important similarities between Skallagrímur and Egill. They're both in the role of the ugly brother who's raised up in the shadow of the accomplished Þórólfur and outlives him. So in a way, history repeats itself almost with the same kind of characters and partially with the same names. But this idea of double reality is also visible in the saga in what you might call the metamorphosis of Kveldúlfur, Skallagrímur, and Egill, who all have animalistic nature that can take over their human personality. Anna Holtzmark has pointed out that the characterization of Kveldúlfur seems to be inspired by a werewolf motif, and Úlfur means a wolf, and actually his Christian name is Úlfur, but this Kveld means evening, so in the evening he would start to behave strangely, something like a werewolf, and it's the same taking place with Skallagrímur. At one point in the saga he's playing some kind of a hockey actually with Egill and a friend of Egill, and they are in a way beating him, and he becomes angry and he kills the friend of his son. So very animalistic. And there are scenes in the saga when you see Egill alluding to this, to the animal in Egill. At one point he is tricking one of his adversaries, Bergönundur, to search in the shrubs for a bear that has been roaming in the neighborhood at the farm of Bergönundur, causing all sorts of damage and killing people and animals. And Egill, he tells the farmhand there that this is where the bear is, that this is where you can find him. But when Bergönundur starts to look for the bear, he meets Egill, of course, and Egill is not very friendly at that point. But we should also remember that Egil's saga contains numerous repeated motifs. And from a very general perspective, you might say that the most common narrative function in Egil's saga is very simple. This is a narrative function that's being repeated again and again and again. Like in many other family sagas, an Icelander of the 17th century said all the family sagas they can be put into one sentence. Farmers killing each other or farmer beating each other. But in Egil's saga you have the same killing scenes being repeated with little change very often. And I'm just going to mention a few examples. There's especially one scene that I find important. Þórólfur, the son of Kveldúlfur, he kills the standard bearer of King Haraldur before the king himself delivers Þórólfur the mortal blow. And we are told that Þórólfur thrust his sword through the standard bearer. And Þórólfur, the younger Þórólfur, the son of Skallagrímur, he is more successful when he found himself in a similar situation, as he first killed the standard bearer of Earl Ring, and then drove the spear through the Earl's coat of mail into his chest and through his body so that it came out between his shoulder blades. And he lifted him up on it above his head and thrust the end into the ground. This is actually a scene you can find in other sagas too, but these scenes are very, very similar. I also want to mention a scene when Egill is in Norway and he's on a boat passing the ship of King Eiríkur Bloodaxe, and we are told that he threw a spear, striking the helmsman Kjetil the Slayer through the middle. And later Egill kills Bergundur's brother, two brothers, Hatt and Fróði. No, Hatt, who is the brother of Bergundur, and Fróði, who is a close relative of the king. And the description in the saga is, Egill lunged at Fróði with his halberd, piercing his shield and plunging so deep into his chest that the point came through his back. So you see it's repeated, the same description. I could go on for a very long time with examples from Egill's saga that relate to Das Unheimliche by Freud, but I just want to discuss very briefly how Freud explains the fact that we find scenes of this sort uncanny. He suggests, as you probably all know or at least suspect, that the uncanniness of dismembered limbs, a severed head and a hand cut at the wrist springs from its association with the castration complex. This is very Freudian, of course. But he finds it more difficult to explain the uncanniness of the doppelganger. The image of the double, he says, with reference to the writings of Otto Rank, can be traced to the narcissistic states in our youth and in the primitive man, when the mirror image seems to confirm our immortality. As we mature, the doppelganger turns into the ghastly harbinger of death. But the double, Freud adds, may also be a remainder from that period in our youth when the subject starts to divide itself into id, ego, and superego. As far as recurrences of the same situations, things, and events is concerned, he relates an interesting story about his own experience when he got lost in a provincial town in Italy. And his repeated attempts to find his ways always led him back to the same narrow street where, quote, painted women were to be seen at the windows of the small houses. He's really revealing himself in this part of the essay. But he found this experience very uncanny. But and he started to think maybe that human beings, as human beings, we have a powerful repetition impulse which may contradict our basic desire for pleasure. And he addresses this paradox directly in an article that he calls Jenseits der Lustprinzips, where he describes how small children sometimes repeat the painful and difficult experience, such as separations from the parents when it's like fourth dag, they have maybe a beer or something they like, and they let it disappear and come again. Or we do like this with our children, and the same pattern can be found in the behavior of people with mental disorders, who in their sleep and even when they are awake experience certain traumas from the past again and again. And Freud suggests that the aim of the child may be to gain control over difficult experience by acting it out But he also believes that the repetition, or what he called the repetition compulsion in mental disturbed people, is involuntary. The patient is the prey of painful memories destined to relive the past as an eternal repeated present. So what can we say about Egilssaga in this from this perspective? I want to suggest that maybe our reading experience is parallel to Freud's uncanny walk in the Italian city. Again and again we come across similar descriptions which are likely to get mixed up in our confused minds as we continue to read. We don't make a very clear distinction, for instance, between the death of the older Þórólfur and the younger Þórólfur when we finished the story. And it's the same with these moments when somebody is killed and the spear or the sword will go out in the back. I think the contradictory impact of the saga may partially stem from the fact that the author repeats the same narrative functions of such a compulsive insistency that the repetition itself becomes both conciliating and very uncanny. But still, I don't think that explains why this young woman in the college where I taught had to go to the bathroom. So bear with me. We have to continue. In her book, The Powers of Horror, written published in 1980, Julia Kristeva tries to define the effects of the horror that images of what she calls the abject can have on us. And just like Freud, in his discussion of the uncanny, she believes that various things that we experience in our youth continue to haunt us throughout our lives. But she focuses on the first months of the child's existence, when it starts to experience its separation from the mother, but has not formed an independent identity. At this point, she argues, the child feels that it's an abject, and it's a term she coins with reference to the words subject and object. We are somewhere in between. According to her, the emotions of the child are in turmoil at this stage, and it desires to be reunited with the mother, but at the same time it's afraid of termination. And the child, as a result, may enter into a period of complete denial of the outer world, throwing away the things that are around it, and even vomiting everything that it's supposed to eat. And she claims that food, various kinds of waste, excrement and garbage are among the things that can trigger the horror of the abject later in our lives. And she describes her own reaction when the eyes see or the lips touch that skin on the surface of milk, harmless, thin as a sheet of cigarette paper, pitiful as a nail paring. And she writes, I experience a gagging sensation, and still further down, spasm in the stomach, the belly, and all the organs shrivel up the body, provoke tears and bile, increase heartbeat, and cause forehead and hands to perspire. And I'm sure you all have had this experience from something. I mean, when I was a young boy, I could not eat hot boiled blood sausages, what we called slaughter in Icelandic. It was the only food that I couldn't eat, and I think the reason was that I saw it made from blood. My parents were doing it one day, and then at night they said, please eat. But the juices of the body, spittle, blood, urine, sweat, and tears can also cause additional terror, according to Kristeva, as they all have an ambiguous status. These liquids, just like that child at the stage of abjection, are marginal things. They are traversing the boundaries of the body, being both a part of me and something other. Vomit can be added to this list, and because it's on this border of being nourishment and excrement. And if we look for images of this nature in Egilssaga, we have a field day. The scene describing the dealings of Egill and Ármóður calls our attention, for instance. Ármóður is the one that loses his eye. Well, Egill is traveling in northern Norway, and they get to this farm of Ármóður, and Ármóður says, well, I'm sorry I don't have any beer, any meat for you, but he gives them skyr, which is, isn't that whey in English? Yeah. So.
It's actually more sort of like a yogurt.
Yeah.
It's a thinner yogurt.
Okay. Yeah, similar to yogurt.
Yeah.
And then after they've had this skyr, he said, well, I have some beer. And of course, these things don't mix well. But Egill, he drinks the beer. But at a certain point, he started to feel that, and I'm quoting the saga, he started to feel that he would not be able to go on like this. He stood up and walked across the floor where Ármóður was sitting. This is happening before he picks out his eye. He seized him by the shoulder and thrust him up against the wall post. Then Egill spewed a torrent of vomit that gushed all over Ármóður's face, filling his eyes and nostrils and mouth and pouring down his chest. Ármóður was close to choking, and when he managed to let out his breath, a jet of vomit gushed out with it. So I hope you haven't eaten too much today. But this is, I mean, this really explains this reaction of the young woman in the school, I think. Let me see. Yeah, we might say that as readers, when we perceive this scene, it gushes all over our face, so to speak, and it may cause powerful physical reflex in some people. But some people, they just enjoy it because it's so gross. But another side of the abject can be referred to the beastly nature of Egill, his father and grandfather, that I mentioned earlier. The abject, Kristeva writes, confronts us with those fragile states where man strays on the territories of animal. Thus, by way of abjection, primitive societies have marked out a precise area of the culture in order to remove it from the threatening world of animal and animalism, which were imagined as representatives of sex and murder. And in relation to this quotation from Kristeva, it's interesting to recall a fight of Egill and Atli the Short. So Egill is fighting Atli, and he realizes at one point that his opponent cannot be killed with a sword because he has some magic helping him out. Atli has some magic. And Egill tries alternative measures. Let me see. Yeah, I actually had this quote up there, but this is Egill and Atli. Egill saw that this was pointless because his own shield was splitting through by then as well. He threw down his sword and shield, ran for Atli and grabbed him with his hands. By his great strength, Egill pushed Atli over backwards, then sprawled over him and bit through his throat. Atli died on the spot. No wonder. Egill rushed to his feet and ran over to the sacrificial bull, took it by the nostrils with one hand and by the horns by the other, and swung it over onto its back, breaking its neck. And it's striking, I think, how killing of a human being and a sacrifice of an animal go hand in hand in this scene. And the method of killing is similar in both instances. Egill pushes Atli backwards and he swings the bull on his back. But the difference lies in the fact that he bites through Atli's throat but breaks the neck of the bull. In her book, Kristeva suggests that the history of religion depicts the various ways humanity has tried to purify the abject, develop acceptable ways, sacrifices for instance, to what she says, to stage the abject. Art, in particular the art of literature, has in many ways taken over this role of purification, she adds. And from this perspective, we may speculate whether the text that depicts Egill's double sacrifice may serve the same purpose as an actual sacrifice. It's just being staged in literature. The animalistic impulses of the audience are being recognized momentarily. We are relieved from our humanity, but only to have this humanity firmly confirmed. Well, one more example of the abject that Kristeva discusses is the corpse. Faced with a dead being, she claims, we feel that the borders of our existence are being erased. I've already suggested there are plenty of corpses in Egil's saga, but at this point I would like to emphasize that there are three different examples of the abject: horrific foods, beastly humans, and lifeless bodies that merge in one in many of the skaldic verses of the saga. It doesn't really count to show you these translations of the skaldic verses because they are much more simple than in the original Icelandic. When you show these to Icelanders, they don't understand anything. You understand everything in the English because in the skaldic verses the words are both very complex. These are words that you don't understand anymore, but also they have been rearranged, so you have to start to arrange them in a proper order to get any sense out of them. But in Egil's saga, I think I can detect three stages what Egil does again and again in his verses is to compare killings of one human being of another to beasts that are beasts of prey. And at the first stage, there's a sharp distinction between the killer and the beast of prey. The killer is often described as a host, even as a steward who invites the animal to dinner. And that's the first example. I fed the wolf with corpses, killed them all myself. You can see that Egil is there, he's killing somebody, so the wolf gets something to eat. But at the second stage, the difference between the human fighter and the beast is blurred. And that's the second example. Hringur entered the weapon fray, and the ravens did not starve. You don't see actually, instead of seeing like the chain of events at the first stage, a man kills another and thereby supplies food for the beasts. The action of man and animal are simply parallel. But at the third stage, and it is the third example, a description of the way in which the animal preys on the body replaces the actual killing scene. And this example is from a well-known poem by Egil called The Head Ransom. And we don't see any human beings. We only see the animals. And in a way it strengthened this idea that Egil is in some way, or the killer is in some way animalistic. The warrior and the beast have merged into the same person. And we cannot be sure if Egil is describing the activities of humans or animals, a fight or a feast, someone who is eating or sailing, because in the original the beak of the raven is characterized as the prow of the head, and it's just an idea of how complex this poetry is often, that there are many images merging into one. But we who read this poetry, let's say if we understand it, and that's really an if there, we are not only faced with images of our imminent destruction, the text itself deconstructs some of the principal oppositions that our system of signification rests upon. The corpse is at the same time a symbol of death and nourishment, and the killing is both a destruction and creation, and the subject is concurrently a man and an animal and even an object like a ship. So you might say that the experience of the object is being reflected in language itself. So I think, or I hope, you may have may understand why the woman had to be excused when she was in class. But I want to continue, though. It may seem that Freud and Kristeva reach far into the childhood to explain the uncanny emotions and the horror that haunt us. But Georges Bataille, he reaches, in a certain sense, even further back. In a book he published called Eroticism in 1957, to explain the fears he believes we have of our erotic impulses. His argument, at least, is partially based on the difference between asexual reproduction of elementary organisms and sexual reproductions of more complex organisms. Eroticism, he claims, quote, unlike simple sexual activity, is a psychological quest independent of the natural goal, reproduction and desire for children. It certainly is an exuberance of life, but at the same time, this psychological quest is not alien to death. Bataille explains this paradox with reference to the way in which two nuclei are formed from a single cell. Asexual reproduction means that the original cell ceases to exist, but at the stage of the productive process, Bataille claims there is indeed a continuity of being. The same continuity cannot occur in the death of sexual creatures, where reproduction is in theory independent of death and disappearance. So in our lives, two individuals create the third one, confirming their destinies as discontinuous beings. But Bataille argues that we yearn for our last continuity. We desire to create in death, just like the cell does at the stage of reproduction. And this is what he calls the erotic desire, a desire tormented by the fear of self-annihilation. And I realize that this sounds completely as a Latin to all of us, but this is the theory he has for the background theory for his explanation of what he calls the erotic desire. He discusses three types of eroticism: physical, emotional, and religious. And in a way, it's the religious one that I'm mostly interested in. His aim is to show that with all of them, the concern is to substitute for the individual isolated discontinuity a feeling of profound continuity. So lovemaking and sacrifice, ecstasy and death are in his depiction united. He discusses in particular the impact of human sacrifice on its audience. And he writes, in sacrifice, the victim is divested not only of clothes but of life, or is destroyed in some way if it is an inanimated object. The victim dies and the spectators share in what his death reveals. A violent death disrupts the creature's discontinuity. What remains, what the tense onlookers experience in the succeeding silence, is the continuity of all existence with which the victim is now one. Well, we have observed the scenes in Egil's saga where Egil concurrently kills Atli the Short and sacrifices a bull. But there's another interesting scene from the saga involving bulls that's inspired by an axe which the Norwegian king, Eiríkur Blood Axe, sends with Þórólfur, the younger Þórólfur, back to Iceland. So Þórólfur has been a friend of Eiríkur, and Eiríkur gives him this axe and says, "Give this to your father as a sign of friendship." But the Skallagrímur he doesn't want his son to be involved with the king because he knows that his brother, there came nothing good of his relationship with the earlier king, and he said, well, we shouldn't be friends with the king, and that explains how he behaves when he gets this axe. Skallagrímur took the axe, held it up, and inspected it for a while without speaking, then hung it up above his bed. So it's hanging there for some time. At Borg one day in the autumn, Skallagrímur had a large number of oxen driven to his farm to be slaughtered. He had 2 of them tethered up against the wall with their heads together and took a large slab of rock and placed it under their necks. And I had read this scene quite often before I realized what's being described. So he has a stone, and then he has 2 of these animals. It's not a good drawing. And this, so he places them like this. And then he cuts through them both at the same time. And so you can imagine that they stand for some time without their heads, and their necks probably touching. And you need quite a good imagination just to not to realize the scene, but to write it up. And his idea is to partially, the axe. At the end of the quote, he chopped off the oxen's head, but when it went right through and struck the stone, the mount broke completely and the blade shattered. Skallagrímur inspected the edge without saying a word, then went into the fire room, climbed up on the bench, and put the axe on the rafters above the door, where it was left that winter. So he gets this beautiful present, and he, on purpose, ruins it. But at the same time, it's related to this strange sacrificial scene. Of course, in the context of the saga, it's just plain butchering. But I think it may serve the same purpose for us as readers as a sacrifice. We see how the animals are destroyed, just like inanimated objects, and this is emphasized in a way by the fact that King Eiríkur's gift to Skallagrímur is also being destroyed. And the whole thing, it resembles a rite, I think. We are faced with these 2 headless animals, probably staggering on their feet for a moment or 2 before falling to the either side. And I think Bataille would say that at this moment we should be able to experience the continuity of all existence. But I also want to make a note of the fact that Eiríkur, he's always called Eiríkur Blood Axe, the Eiríkur with the bloody axe, and in a way Skallagrímur is communicating his, well, this is what he wanted to do with Eiríkur, not only the axe. So it's a very symbolic scene.
When I read that,
Yes?
well, like having some sense of how big an ox is,
Yes.
I thought that was enabling the listener, because I always, when I'm reading them, I'm always imagining it being
Read.
told out loud.
Yes.
And so then I see how big this axe is.
Mm-hmm.
If it can go through these two animals at one blow,
Mm-hmm.
it is enormous.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was a totally visual thing, like almost bloodless, because I was just visualizing the size
Of the axe, yeah.
the king's
Yeah.
king's gift.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was how I saw it, and I really like your drawing because
Yeah, well,
that's really interesting.
well, probably, I mean, when the heads are off,
Uh-huh.
I mean, you have these two animals, and they're very strange animals.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But it's quite an imagination, or maybe this is something ritualistic. That's possible. Okay, but in this context, I want to quote Bataille once more. He writes, "Poetry leads to the same place as all forms of eroticism, to the blending and fusion of separate objects. It leads us to eternity, it leads us to death, and through death to continuity." And at least that's, I mean, the skaldic poetry is all about this. It's about mixing together things or ideas that you would think that couldn't be mixed together. Well, Bataille, of course, also discusses erotic sexual intercourse, and he suggests that it's an act of transgression of various social constraints. Egil's saga has many sides, but the author does not show explicit interest in depicting people in a sexual intercourse. When Þórólfur marries Egil's foster sister, Ásgerður, the younger Þórólfur, he marries Ásgerður, who actually is brought up at the farm with Egil, so they are childhood friends, Egil and Ásgerður. The author is completely silent about their first night together. In fact, the point of view in this part of the saga sticks to Egil. And this is a very interesting, I mean, from the point of view of narrative technique, it's very interesting that Egil, he is in Norway with Þórólfur, and Þórólfur's idea is to take Ásgerður to her relatives who live in Norway. And when Egil realizes Þórólfur is going to do that, he says, I want to come with you. And Þórólfur doesn't want to allow him to come with them, but Egil makes sure that he's taken with him on the ship. And then later he is told that they are going to marry. And Þórólfur and his men are going to the marriage, to the, what do you call it? Not the marriage. Wedding. And all of a sudden Egil feels sick and he doesn't come with them. And most people who read the saga, they say he's not sick, he just doesn't want to be present. But at this point, the point of view of the saga is the point of view of Egil. We are not present when they are married. We just see what happens to Egil. So he fell ill at the farm where they are staying. It's the farm of Þórólfur's friend Þórir. So he's unable to join his brother at the feast. But I would argue that there is in this in the following scene, there's a lot of what we might call sexual eroticism. Interestingly enough, Egill recovers soon after Þórólfur has said goodbye to him. So instead of going to the wedding, he goes with Ölvir, who's one of Þórir's farmhands, to another feast. And it's reported that Þórólfur and his men sailed on a large, well-equipped longship to the farm of Ásgerður's father in Sognafjörður, but Egill and Ölvir and 12 other men went on a rowboat towards Atley Island. And I think we might say that the narrative is initially divided into two parallel clues. One is visible and is constituted of images of violence and destruction, but the other clue is concealed. But we can imagine that it's constituted of images of love and unity. And together these two clues make one erotic plot. This is actually a technique that you can see in other literature. There's a very interesting short story by Pushkin that is very similar to Egill in this manner. So we know that Þórólfur and Ásgerður are to be united. But as readers, we follow Egill, and he will meet Queen Gunnhildur, who is actually was on intimate terms with Þórólfur at one point in the saga. And many scholars have pointed this out, that Egill, he is actually jealous because he's in love with Ásgerður. Gunnhildur is also jealous because Þórólfur was one of her many favorites. She had many Icelandic lovers in the saga. So instead of reading about the wedding of Þórólfur and Ásgerður, we follow Egill and their fellow travelers. They approach a large farm in Atley, owned by King Eiríkur Bloodaxe, and is run by his good steward Atleyjar Bárður. And when the visitors meet Bárður, he, quote, led them into a fire room which stood away from the other buildings, where they can dry their clothes. When they have dressed again, a table was laid, and they were given bread and butter and large bowls of curds. That's how they translate skyr in the English translation. And this is taking place before the scene that I mentioned earlier about the eye and all the vomiting. But it's the same scene being repeated twice. But twice Bárður states that he has no beer or ale in his house. But the chapter ends by suggesting that the whole band of men have gone to rest. There were plenty of mattresses in the room, and he, Bárður, invited them to lie down and go to sleep. So Egill is asleep in this small house, and if you think about what's taking place in the other feast, you might say that they're asleep, you know. And everything that happens afterwards here, I think it reflects on the wedding night of Þórólfur and Ásgerður. But in the beginning of the next chapter, the point of view is no longer with Egill, but in the main room of the farm of Atley, where King Eiríkur and his wife Gunnhildur are taking a part in a feast, because a sacrifice was being made to the Dísir. This is a quotation. It was a splendid feast with plenty to drink. Eiríkur asked where Bárður had gone, and when he was told that his steward was attending to Þórir and his men in the firehouse, the king ordered someone to fetch all right away. When they entered the main room, they were immediately served ale, and as the night wore on, many of Ulfr's companions became incapacitated. Some of them vomited inside the main room, while others made it through the door. It's not reported that Egill vomited. In fact, he drank heavily from Ulfr's drinking horn, and then he delivered a verse suggesting that Bárður had deceived them by saying that he was short of fish drink. So Egill knows that he's just trying to make fools out of these poor guests, in front of the other guests. But so unlike his companions, Egill spewed poetry instead of vomit. But the whole scene, just like the scene describing the dealings of Egill and Ármóður, is full of references to the myth about the mead of poetry. That mixture of spittle, blood, honey, and vomit that one is supposed to drink to become a proper poet. Bárður is not very happy to be called a liar by Egill, and he got Queen Gunnhildur to assist him in mixing a poison into Egill's beer. And they intended to put an end to the spew of words that was coming out of Egill's mouth. And from this point on, there are quite a few quotations I want to go into. So Egill took out his knife and stabbed the palm of his hand with it. He took the drinking horn, carved runes on it, and smeared them with blood. And then he speaks a verse. I carve runes on this horn, redden words with my blood. I choose words for the trees of the wild beasts' ear roots. Drink as we wish this mead, brought by merry servants. Let us find out how we fare from the ale that Bárður blessed. So he suspects Gunnhildur and Bárður to be doing something that's dangerous for him, and so his words and his runes are so powerful that the horn shattered and the drink spilled onto the straw. So it's the uncanny power of the runes that possibly saved Egill's life, but at the same time the drinking horn is what you might call the Mysiana beam, like a pocket version of the whole saga, which is of course runes smeared with blood. I mean, we've been going through that. But even though the drinking horn was shattered, the feast continued to the point when Egill leaves. This is not an illustration from Egill's saga. These are women, but this is a medieval image anyways. So Ulfr, who is Egill's friend, the one who was taking him to the feast, he's on the verge of passing out, so Egill got up and led him over the door. He swung his cloak over his shoulders and gripped his sword underneath it. When they reached the door, Bárður went after them with a full horn and asked Ulfr to drink a farewell toast. Egill stood in the doorway and spoke this verse. And it's a beautiful verse in Icelandic, because Ulfr, to be very drunk, is to be Ölvaður in Icelandic, and his name is Ulfr. And so the verse in Icelandic starts Ölvar mig því Ölfr, öl gerir nú fölvan. And so it's a very nice sound to it. So he's not very happy to be interrupted by his host at this point. So after he has delivered his verse, he kills Bárður. Egill tossed away the horn, grabbed hold of his sword and drew it. It was dark in the doorway. He thrust the sword so deep into Bárdur's stomach that the point came out through his back. Have you seen this before? Bárður fell down dead, blood pouring from the wound. Then Ulfr dropped on the floor, spewing vomit. Egill ran out of the room. It was pitch dark outside, and he dashed from the farm. People left the room and saw Bárður and Ulfr lying on the floor together, and imagined at first that they had killed each other. because it was dark, the king had a light brought over, and they could see that Ölvir was lying unconscious in his vomit, but Bárður had been killed, and the floor was awash with his blood. So you remember the two bulls, the two oxen, but now we have these two characters. One is bleeding, and the other one is vomiting, but they are both dead in some sense. And it's similar to the two bulls, and really a wonderful imagination, I think. But the young woman I mentioned at the beginning, she wouldn't agree with me. And of course, in a way, this also relates to the horn that is shattered. I mean, in a way, Bárður is shattered in the same way. His blood is running down onto the floor. It was the meat before. And what we see here is a mirror reflection of somebody who's dead and somebody who has been vomiting. And this, well, my idea is to say that there's also another mirror here between the narrative that we read and the narrative that is not being told. And you can well imagine what happens after they've been married. We are never told what happens, but we are shown something that's similar but still different. And the reflection is neither complete nor coherent. We have to puzzle together these shattered fractions. On the one hand, we see the opponents, Egill and Gunnhildur and Bárð. And on the other hand, we have the newly wedded couple. Gunnhildur, she poisons Egill, and Egill kills Bárður, while Þórólfur and Ásgerður presumably make love. And it seems that the two reflections are quite opposite, but is it so? In the scene at Atli, Egill's drinking horn is in focus. It's a vessel for liquid ale that can be nourishing, but it can also cause nausea and even death. And originally horns are deadly weapons of animals. Actually, Egill referred to them as ox spears in one of his skaldic verses. When he prepared to slay Bárður, he tossed away the horn and he grabbed a hold of another weapon, his sword, which he kept under his cloak. And then he thrust the swords into Bárdur's stomach, so the point comes out of his back. So it cannot be more erotic, I think, at least not in medieval times. And I think Bataille would be very happy with this scene. So if Snorri Sturluson, Freud and Kristeva and Bataille are to be trusted, powerful poetry is in some sense uncanny. One variation of the abject, a spear of the erotic. The myth about the meat of poetry, like Egil's saga, is a narrative in which we find amputations. We have 9 slaves that cut each other heads off, and metamorphosis. At one point in that myth, Odin turns himself into a snake and later into an eagle, and there are also repetitions there. And the poetic meat, as we've seen, is a multiple abject. It's spittle, blood, and vomit. And even the scene in which Odin, in the shape of a snake, crawled into the auger hole, and Bögi stabbed after him with the auger and missed him. It's when Egill is going into the... Well, he's trying to get the meat of poetry from Gunnlöður. And so it's... They drill a hole into a cliff, and Egill... Odin, he turns himself to a snake so he can get through that hole into Gunnhald, to where Gunnlöður is, and the meat of poetry. And at first, Böye, he says, well, you should crawl in. You can crawl in. But Odin, he does like this and sees that the drill, what the drill has left, is coming towards him and not going through the hole. So the hole is not complete. And then he completes the hole. And he meets Gunnlöður, who is in charge of the meat of poetry, and he sleeps with her for 3 nights. So it's a very erotic myth in its own. And I want to conclude by saying that these 2 medieval texts are a very fruitful source of speculation about the nature of poetic language, and also its impact on us as readers. And I would like to finish by asking, to what degree is our reading experience an emotional and even a physical experience? And in my view, at least, Egil's Saga is a very complex texture of powerful impressions, and it's one of these narratives which takes us to the edge of a cliff and tempts us to jump. Not that we necessarily jump, but that's my reaction to it. Thank you.
You'd be happy to entertain questions?
Yes, of course.
I was interested back when you were talking about Freud and the doubling and the repetition of the motifs.
Yes.
I guess when I read it, I assumed that it was because the sagas were written down several centuries after the events they were supposedly reporting, that it was coming from an oral tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of saw it in the same way as the oral tradition. Like in Homer, you've got the constant, same kind of constant. And I sort of saw that as just being part of the narrative in the storytelling tradition. There's a lot of repetition as part of keeping continuity going in the narrative process.
Mm-hmm.
But I found your connecting it to Freud really interesting. I hadn't seen it in that way at all. So
well,
maybe that applies to Homer as well.
Yeah, well, repetition is of course such a big
Yeah.
part of narrative,
Yeah.
and it probably has. It partially has these natural explanations
Mhm.
why it is so. I mean, we always have 3 brothers and 3 sisters in the fairy tales, etc. But then, at the other hand, if you think about it in terms of us listening or reading, I mean, when I read to my kids, you know, they even want to have the same story being read again and again, and they want to be afraid at the same time. You know, there's also this need we have for repetition. But I think Snorri, or whomever wrote Egil's Saga, is really doing a lot of these things conscientiously, but at the same time he's playing on our subconsciousness, and I think it makes Egil's Saga very special, because it's so much addressing our soul rather than just our brains. You know, and there's a very interesting article, for instance, by two scholars, Icelandic and a Danish one, that were addressing the fact that the logic of Egil's Saga is the logic of dreams in some sense, and there's something to be said about that.
Could you repeat, please, the last sentence? The logic of Egil's Saga is the logic
Of dreams.
Oh, dreams.
Dreams,
Okay,
yeah.
sorry.
It's a dream logic. Yeah. At least that's my sense with this scene. You know, after Egil falls asleep here in Atley, and what happens afterwards. It's such an amazing scene with him cutting the runes on the horn, and you know, the whole thing is it's like a nightmare. Yeah.
But and also it's like time stands still. If you're like in a dream where things are sometimes moving but sometimes just there.
Mm-hmm.
and you don't know where they're coming from necessarily.
Yeah, and I found it. I think it has importance that Egil and his fellows, his fellow travelers, we are told that they go to sleep, and then the saga, the point of view is directed to the other place in the farm, and then they enter. So it's you might almost say that it is a dream, in some sense, but. And there have been very interesting writings on the relationship between Ásgerður, Þórólfur, and Egil, of course, and in a way, Egil he's responsible for dragging Þórólfur away from his wife. They get at, after this scene, they are at odds with Eiríkur, the blood axe, because Egil has killed his steward, and they continue to be at odds with him, and they end up in Britain, and that's where Þórólfur is killed. And some people might say that maybe subconsciously, maybe consciously, Egil is taking his brother away from Ásgerður, and after he dies, Egil marries her. So,
which was what was supposed to happen anyway.
Pardon?
Well, I thought that's what was supposed to happen anyway. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's so much like all those stories like Tristan and Isolde, and it's just the way fate moves, and
but
secret alliances.
Yeah.
And
well, what I'm saying is Egil is moving fate, in a way, by what he does. And it's a very moving scene when Þórólfur has died, and Egil he wants to approach Ásgerður, but he's not ready to do it. And a friend of his says, "Well, what's wrong with you?" And he delivers a verse that, if you understand it correctly, you understand that this is what he wants to do. And it's one of those many sides of Egil. He's a very emotional person, even if he's just a violent brute. On the other hand.
I found that the poetry you're talking about, how difficult it is in the original, was interesting, because in the translation that we read, they would translate the poems, but then there'd be all these footnotes, and they'd give like the literal translations, and they were totally different.
Yes.
And it was like, how did they get this from that? I really wonder how that process, how the translation process works. How people figured out what. Is it part of it? There's a long tradition that this stands for that in some sort of way?
Yeah, well, some of the things in the poetry, you have to know your poetic Edda. You have to know the myths, because they refer to the myths. But even today, people disagree about the meanings of many of these poems, because what you have to do is to take the words and put them in the right order, and then you have to find clusters of words. So Egil would not say a drinking horn. He would say the spear of the bull, or the spear of the oxen, and that's the horn. And you might have many of these clusters of words. So he would say the blood of the spear of the oxen. It means beer. So why didn't he say beer or meat? But that's poetry. And then when you have an English translation, it's like the fourth translation, because you have to translate in Icelandic, 2 or 3 times before you get a meaning, and then so it's very far removed from what you might say the original text. But it keeps a lot of people busy.
First of all, I really love how you apply these sort of psychoanalytic theories to the text. Do you have, within that framework, do you have any kind of comment on the alternation between the prose and the verse sections of the saga, and what kind of formal effect that might have within Freud or Gustave's Do you know what I'm...
Well, not. I don't have much more to say about it than what I did. That it seems to be inherent in the way this poetry is composed. Is to blend together senses that don't really make sense. You know, the corpse is a feast, if you see what I mean. But there has been very interesting writing on the relationship between the verse and the prose. Many people think that the verses are older, more original, and actually that they are the sources for the narrative. In the last few decades, more and more people say, well, the prose and the verses were composed at the same time because they relate so closely together. I don't think you could say that either is wrong or right. I think it depends on the sagas, it depends on the verses, etc. But nowadays, you know, almost everybody wants to believe that Snorri wrote Egil Saga, and about 50% of them say he also wrote the poetry. But what I find most intriguing about people who have been addressing this is there's a very nice article by Lawrence Deleuze, who's an American scholar who teaches here in Canada, in London, not far from Toronto, I think. And he wrote three articles on what we call the skaldic family sagas. So family sagas where you have a poet as the main person. And he points out that in a way a lot of the poetry is self-reflective, in a way very postmodernistic. The first poems that Egil composes, there are two poems he composes because he goes to his grandfather's feast. And he says in his poetry, I'm here at my grandfather's feast and I'm delivering this poem and I hope you will give me something as a reward. And then the grandfather gives him a reward and he says, well, my grandfather is so generous, he gave me this reward because I composed this poetry. So it's a poetry that deals with itself in a way. It's a very nice reading of the saga that Lawrence Deleuze was doing in this sense. And he says in a way that all of this poetry in the skaldic family sagas is very much self-reflective and sometimes it is what you might call the mise en abîme, that in a way you have the whole theme of the saga being framed in one verse or a couple of verses, and in a way the last the last scene in the saga is when people, I think 200 years after Egil Saga takes place, people are finding his head in a churchyard, and it's a very hard head. And some theories they deal with the fact that maybe he had a disease, a Patch's disease, so nobody could kill him. Actually, he had such a hard head because the skull would always get thicker and thicker. But Lawrence Deleuze he points to the fact that Egil's best-known poem is called The Head Ransom. That King Eiríkur is going to kill Egil. He's able to kill Egil, but Egil said, well, I will compose this poetry about you and I will get my head instead. And it ties in with this final scene when you have the head of Egil there. And there are a lot of references and mirror images in Egil Saga that you can play with for a very long time. And I think it makes it quite special in the genre of the Icelandic family sagas.
Perhaps it's time to let you go back to bed. Not back to bed, but give you a chance to catch up on your jet lag and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And tomorrow night or tomorrow afternoon?
Tomorrow morning, 11:30.
11:30.